So it is the anniversary of the Uniting Church, and I encourage you to go, if you've got access to the internet, to go online and to watch Andrew Dutney's video message about the challenges and possibilities that face the Uniting Church, and he particularly emphasises the call to be a multicultural church. But I'm not going to talk about big church today. I'm going to talk about little church, about our church and about us, about exploring what it is to be this particular community of faith in the Uniting Church. You might wonder where I'm going with David and Goliath on that, but it will unfold. So David, facing the Philistine giant. The poem from David White, The True Love, which is really about another story of Jesus on the lake in the storm, the walking on water story, but one that also speaks to the theme I want to explore today. And Jesus facing that storm in the boat on Lake Galilee. Our texts look at people being confronted with the worst threat that they could imagine. These stories invite us to reflect on how we respond to threatening giants and storms, how we respond to our fears when they threaten to overpower us. Both the biblical stories tell of people facing fright and terror with calm and with trust. Trust is a mysterious aspect of our humanity. How do we learn to trust? How is trust regained when it has been lost? Seriously abused children who have been rescued and placed in loving families take a long time to regain trust in adults. Researchers in the UK used a story to try and understand the thinking of abused children who have learned to trust and those who remain yet untrusting. A psychotherapist in the study said, "One of the first stories we used is about spilt juice. We describe how the mum pours out juice for the family, but the son spills his on the table. She says, 'Oh no, John has spilt his juice.' And then the child is asked, 'What do you think happens next?' One child who had managed to adapt well to her new life said the mother would say, 'Come and help me clean it up,' and they would do it together even though the mum was cross. But another child said the boy would take the jug and empty it over the mother's head. One boy finished the story by saying that the child would be put in jail, and another said that the whole house would end up on fire as the table was close to the oven. These responses revealed a catastrophic way of thinking that shows that the child finds it extremely difficult to trust or rely on adults, and that they have not yet found a sensible way of solving their dilemmas. The positive result of the research was that when the children had been placed in loving families were questioned 1 year and 2 years later, the stories became increasingly less fearful and chaotic. They were learning to trust the adults, and trust is essential to survival and thriving, because to be human is to be in relation. The biblical stories invite hearers to trust in God, which is to trust in life. In the Hebrew Bible story of David and Goliath, the priorities and realities of God are shown to be not the obvious ones valued by the dominant society. As a story for us today, it has a few major limitations. It supports a violent resolution to differences, and it fails to address the call of Jesus to love our enemies. However, in its time, it would have moved its hearers to question dominant wisdom. We can appreciate it today as a stage in the development of Jesus' thought, in Jewish thought, a stage that Jesus and his contemporaries took much further. Even so, in this story are seeds of a new understanding of enemies. And we are told that military might is not supreme. Notions of appropriate leadership and the power needed to sustain it are turned upside down. God's way contradicts conventional wisdom. The hopeless have their hope renewed. Through the story, the character of David is portrayed as calm, displaying a quiet confidence that he knows what to do in the situation. drawing on his experience of protecting his stock from wild animals, trusting that Yahweh is with him and that it is Yahweh's will that he is needed to do. David's calm and trust are contagious. When the Israelites see that he has brought down the giant, calm overcomes them too, and their fears are overcome. The story of David and Goliath is often told about less powerful individuals or groups taking on institutions of power. Gandhi versus the British Empire, Erin Brockovich versus the multinational insurance company, Oscar Romero versus the Salvadoran government. These are great stories, and these people are heroes. But I think that this story can also speak to our personal lives. Goliath can be our internal fear and anxiety. To qualify as a Goliath, the fear must be like a monster that is terrifying and overpowering. In fact, for most of us, by the time we're adults, we've managed to avoid facing our inner fears so successfully that we don't even know what we're afraid of until the moment comes when the confrontation is unavoidable. Can you think for a moment about what it is that you fear, and let the story of David and Goliath speak to it? The gospel story of Jesus calming the storm also tells of fears being faced with trust. After preaching a series of parables, Jesus asks his disciples to take him across the lake to get away from the crowd that's been following him. The lake, while familiar to these experienced boatmen and fishermen, was still unpredictable and always to be respected and feared. On this evening, it shows its full force as a sudden wind blows up, the waves almost swamping the boat. Jesus, protected in the stern of the boat, is asleep. Finally, in despair, the disciples wake him. "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" they say, showing their fear and perhaps their frustration. Jesus awakens, and as if the wind were a spirit, he rebukes it. The wind obeys, and there is calm. The literal truth of these stories is not the point. They were written down because of the truths they point to in the human condition. These stories help us to realize that divine energy does not usually remove storms from our lives, but rather helps us to face them. Trust in God. Trust in an alternative wisdom, despite the storms and the Goliaths with which we may be faced. Trusting like that enables us to be calm and to have courage and hope. The readings remind us that, like David, people have the spiritual resources within themselves and from their cultural and religious heritage to deal with the fears they face. David didn't need the armour that was offered by Saul, but he, like us, had innate gifts and abilities of being human. Unarmoured, God can work through us when we are free to be ourselves. Though I believe that we have the potential to live like this, many of us don't. Many of us live limited and afraid, living with our secret fears and insecurities, especially in so many of us of self-doubt. Even those of us who on the surface seem confident and successful often struggle with that. So how can trust be nurtured? How does trust in God and in others develop? Trust is developmentally normal, but it is fragile. Babies are born with an instinct to trust, the instinct to attach to the mother's breast and to suckle, to nestle in, to expect protection. But trust only grows if needs are met. It is easily lost through neglect or abuse, as we saw in the children's responses to the spilt juice story. Trust, I think, is an orientation of expectation of care. It doesn't depend on everything always working out the way we hope. Trust can be maintained when things are difficult and challenging and unfair, even in situations of violence, as long as the person is not left alone and unsupported. For trust to grow, we need the experience of solidarity, of standing with, of helping one another face the storms. For me, the community of church reminds us that we shouldn't limit the nurturing of trust to biological family. Trust needs wider community too. Sometimes birth and marital families fail terribly. Sometimes too much pressure is placed on family, and it is more than it can sustain. Friendship relationships become crucial. Even when families are strong, we need to create community beyond family. Trust is built when people have the experience of being accompanied with compassion through life. In churches, we have called this pastoral care. Pastoral care is a communal art, bringing laity and clergy together to offer ministries of transforming care to one another and to those outside the boundaries of our congregations. We conspire and collaborate with others to bring forth new life and hope from the creative tensions of living. It can happen in many places: at morning tea, in a phone call, in a conversation over a meal, in a visit to home or hospital, in a card sent at a time of crisis, in creating an environment where children are equal and full members of our community. Part of my motivation of planning for worship each week involves my desire to care for this gathered community. It also happens in every moment and place when you indicate to another human being, where you live or work or play, that you are there for them, that you are willing to listen. One of the contributions that feminist theology has made to our understanding of care and community is that care is mutual, can be mutual. We do not dispense care to those whose lives are less together than our own. Mutuality is the capacity to affect and be affected by another human being. It's not about fixing it for others, but about listening rather than offering advice. For me, one of the appealing things about referring to those who have recognised caring roles in the congregation, referring to them as pastoral friends rather than elders, is that it has a sense of mutuality. The gospel happens when we are open to relationship with each other. Indian theologian D.T. Niles once said that Christianity is one beggar showing another beggar where to find food. No one of us is without problems and fears and self-doubts. We enter a pastoral conversation or situation knowing that we too need grace, fully aware of our own humanity, and that what we have to offer of ourselves comes from this starting point. Authentic trust-building care doesn't create dependency or reinforce isolation. Its goal is the creation of a community, building up relationships. And it is linked to our struggles for justice. Growing in trust builds us as a people, willing to take on forces of violence and injustice that seem bigger than we are. Trust that helps to keep us still and centred when we are faced with fearful situations is needed in the work of justice. This community becomes a place where we can ask, what is life about? Where is the sacred? Where we can help one another to answer that question of Jesus, don't you care? Jesus knew and trusted God's care, and we can invite one another into that understanding. Our task is to nurture one another so deeply, so radically, that we too are in no doubt that God cares. Of course, it's really important to say this on any Sunday when we're reflecting about the church, that we will not do this perfectly. We are human, we will fail, and we will disappoint each other. But the underlying experience of seeing sacred love and the love of community and friends and lovers and family and church enables us to take that love beyond ourselves into the lives of all we meet along the way. David trusted that Yahweh was with him. Trust is fundamental to confronting our fears, because this is where fear attacks us. It tells us that we are on our own, that there are no winds at our back. We avoid, we deny, we rationalise, and it's all fear. Each of us must make a fundamental choice sometime in our life. Is the universe for us or against us? If it's for us, and if we're ready to confront our Goliath, God is with us. It doesn't mean that everything works out well, but the life of faith consists in stepping into life with the fundamental conviction that something is at work, something that is for life, for love, for goodness. Think of Jesus in the poem, stepping out of the boat. You find your support only after you've taken your first step.